Hello, my name is Randy Kluver, and I'm the Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships at Oklahoma State University. I'm very pleased today to have as our guest John Sipher, who has a long and illustrious career, both with the U.S. government as well as in private industry. And John is speaking tonight at Oklahoma State University on the U.S. relationship with Russia, particularly the relationship under Vladimir Putin. But we wanted to take the opportunity to get to know John a little bit better in this interview. So I'm just going to be asking him a few questions about his career and so on. So John, welcome to Oklahoma State.
Thank you, glad to be here.
Is your first trip to Oklahoma?
It is not my first trip to Oklahoma. As you know, Meredith Woodruff,
Yes.
who is an Oklahoma State grad and involved with the center, she was a boss of mine in CIA and a longtime friend, and I've been out to visit her here before, and she's taken great pride in showing me around the university and Stillwater.
Very good. Well, welcome, and we understand you'll be here all weekend for the football game.
Absolutely.
And everything.
I haven't been to a football game yet, so that's exciting.
Good. Well, it'll be an experience. Well, thanks again for coming and speaking with our students tonight and our community. And why don't you, if you could, just give us a brief outline of your career and the roads you've taken and where they've led you.
Yeah, well, I want to say to start that the road I took wasn't necessarily where I ended up. It's just sort of, as you know, in a career, oftentimes, you start one way and make choices and you end up in different places than you expect. But I'm from upstate New York. Both of my parents are teachers. My father is a college professor and my mother was a elementary school teacher. And I was always interested in doing, something related to politics, history, travel overseas, those type of things. But I was from a small town. I went to school in upstate New York as well, Hobart College. I studied history and was always interested in that. I went to graduate school at Columbia University and studied international affairs. And when I was at Hobart, I did a semester in London, and that was my first time really being overseas, and I really just sort of opened my eyes. I really enjoyed it. I knew that if I could, I'd want to do something in my life that was involved with politics, international affairs, overseas type of work. And at Columbia, I studied international affairs, national security studies. Back then, the Soviet Union was still pretty strong, so there was a lot of interest in sort of Soviet studies, arms control, these type of issues. And so when I graduated from Columbia, I was looking at a variety of things, mostly Washington-based. There's a series of scholarships and things that you could go to work for the U.S. government. And I did an internship at Columbia at State Department's Office of INR, Intelligence and Research.
So give me a time frame. When was this? So
that was 1985, thanks a lot. 1985, I think that was.
Very good. So still very much part of the Cold War.
Yeah, very much Cold War. And so in 1986, I applied to the agency, CIA. And at the time, I thought, because I had gone through graduate school and was sort of interested in sort of academic kind of careers, that I might go into the analytics side of the agency and maybe work for a few years, then go get a PhD or something like that into studies. And as you know, CIA is sort of broken into several large sort of tribes. One is the analytic cadre, which is almost like a big university with experts on every issue, very Washington-based. And then the Clandestine Service, which is sort of our overseas, running spy networks, human espionage, and then a large sort of science and technology piece to that too. But when I got into the agency and started going through training, I learned a lot more about the overseas part, the clandestine part, whereas I thought that I didn't necessarily want to spend a career overseas. I changed my sort of view pretty quickly, and I never actually worked full-time in the analytics side of the house, and quickly switched over to the clandestine side, and 30 years later, I found myself retiring from the clandestine service, having spent a good portion of my career overseas.
So where all did you go? And you mentioned a few minutes earlier that you had spent some time in Jakarta. Are there other places that you've?
Yeah, so in the clandestine service, we tend to work 2 to 4 years in an overseas assignment. There's a variety of different ways this can go, but a lot of people work in U.S. embassies, oftentimes undercover, working as a diplomat or something else. And again, the Soviet Union existed when I first started, and so I went into the area that was going to work on Soviet-Russian issues because we were, as the clandestine service, we were trying to recruit Soviet sources around the world, to include in handling them and dealing with them in Moscow and in Russia. And so I went into that part of the clandestine service. And I spent my first career actually in Scandinavia and was in Helsinki, Finland when the Soviet Union fell. And it was the largest Soviet embassy in the world in Helsinki at the time. And so we were there trying to meet Russian sources as well as East European sources, Chinese, other types of things. I then came back and studied Russian and went to Moscow for my second tour. So I was in Moscow at the time when Boris Yeltsin took over, and there was actually a storming of the parliament, and it was quite a sort of crazy time, leaving Soviet times, whither Russia, what's going to happen with the new Russia, what will the U.S. and Western relationship be with Russia. And then after that, there was, for younger people, there was the war in the Balkans in Yugoslavia, as Yugoslavia started to fall apart. In fact, there was quite a bit of worry when the Soviet Union fell apart, that it would sort of go the way of Yugoslavia, where really these ethnic groups would start killing each other. And so I then went and learned Serbo-Croatian and went to Belgrade in Serbia and spent time there. After that, I worked, training new cadres to go overseas at our sort of training center, clandestine training center. I worked again later in sort of the new Yugoslavia as it was a break after we had gone to war there in that part of the world, Kosovo and Serbia. I then worked on a domestic assignment in the United States, working with the FBI on counterintelligence, counterespionage issues. I worked, like I said, in Jakarta, Indonesia, very focused on terrorism at the time. It's the world's largest Muslim Islamic country, and very interesting. And
I lived in Singapore when the Bali bombings occurred, and so saw just how radically everything changed at that time.
And in fact, there was some Al Qaeda people in Singapore at the time that got wrapped up and arrested.
Yeah, that's right. But
I have to say, Singapore's a pretty cushy place compared to a lot of the rest of Southeast Asia.
We refer to it as Asia Light.
I worked in Pakistan for a year, working on issues related to the Afghan war and terrorism in Pakistan before I retired.
Such an interesting front row seat on history.
It was fun. It is a wonderful career, and there's issues related to what does a secret intelligence organization do? But I think if you talk to Meredith, you talk to others, I think people find that you have to have a real interest in the culture and in the people you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
You have to be interested in those issues and what is America's role in working with those places. And I think most people don't realize that most of the intelligence we collect overseas, we certainly collect some from spies who are committing espionage, and we have lots of capabilities from satellites to other things. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is working in partnership with local people. So there's some countries that we're not aware that we have an overt good relationship with, but we do share a lot of information on compatible things, and they help Americans and help keep Americans safe, places you wouldn't even think about.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about your career is not only have you observed many of these historical events, but you were with the CIA at a time of tremendous transformation of the intelligence community itself. Mm-hmm. After 9/11, of course, and of course now the rise of open source intelligence, which I understand is becoming a much more important part of the intelligence game.
Yeah, I don't know how much your students follow, but the issues like Bellingcat and some of these places, for example, I'm going to be talking on Russia and Putin tonight, but there's some of these places that are doing incredible work with big data, with being able to pull together resources that that frankly would have made my job overseas much harder. If I'm trying to use a false passport or trying to hide what I'm up to, make sure that people can't track my movements with electronics or phones, there's so much out there, cameras in cities and data collection, that it's much harder for sort of the spy part of the work to be done. But it does open up a lot of new avenues into sort of collection that can help the U.S. government collect on a wider variety of issues.
So do you see that the normal work of the clandestine service changing pretty radically in response to it?
I don't think it'll change radically. I think it will change, and we'll have to, like we've done over the years, espionage is probably the world's oldest business, right? And it's changed depending on how the world changes. But at the end of the day, decisions made by political leaders, decisions made by business leaders, decisions that affect us every day are done by humans. And that human-to-human contact, that developing trust and relationships with people, at the end of the day, that's going to be something that's always going to be necessary. I can run a sophisticated operation to break into your computer systems, for example, to try to figure out what you're up to, what you're doing, what is your intent. But at the end of the day, there's so much material on there without people to tell you what it means, or what is the intention, or what in there is real and matters and doesn't matter, and who has influence. It's those personal relationships are always going to be important and will continue to be part and parcel intelligence as well as regular diplomacy.
Sure. But of course, the second part of your career, after you retired from the clandestine service, is talk a little bit about that, what you're doing there.
Well, a lot of people, when they retire from CIA, they go right into sort of contract work. Because they have security clearances, they can continue to work in the area, working on intelligence issues. I'm not exactly sure why I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something sort of very different. So when I first left, I started working for a consulting company, Stan McChrystal. He was the head of Special Forces, the COs, Delta Force, or JSOC. And he was the head guy in Afghanistan and was fighting terrorism in Iraq. And he started a company to work with the private sector and businesses, not any government contracts of any type, to try to help them in terms of sort of leadership issues and management issues for working with CEOs to figure out how they can manage and run their organizations. And he used the examples of how when they went to Iraq, probably the best trained, best resourced military fighting force in the world was essentially losing to these ragtag terrorists. And in fact, now after Afghanistan, it's probably another issue to see. And he talked about how they had to sort of change the way they looked at what they did, bring more people in, how to sort of push decision-making down and stuff. So I worked for a few years working with private businesses, a number of sort of big companies and leadership in those companies. And then I started working with a few sort of retired agency folks, sort of an odd thing, sort of hooked up with some Hollywood people, and created a small company to try to work with Hollywood to help them on, content for movies, television shows, streaming shows. Because many of the sort of spy shows, espionage shows out there are really just action thrillers, right? There's lots of car chases and gun fights, and that's not really our world. And so we wanted to try to sort of help bring some sort of reality to some of these type of shows. And that area is sort of exploding now with so many of these streaming shows. We wanted to sort of create a sort of a center of excellence where Hollywood could come to find experts, people to talk to them on these issues. And so we spent a lot of time every day mostly with Hollywood writers and producers, trying to talk through, help them create worlds where they can, tell the stories that they want to tell. And I find it's fun, it's creative, it's totally different from anything I've done before, but it's enjoyable.
Yeah, what an interesting project. I just read an article a couple of days ago that said that there's a fire protection consultant who knows fire sprinklers, and every movie gets the fire sprinklers wrong in terms of how that process looks like. And so I can imagine when it comes to espionage and so on that there's a lot of made up realities.
There it is, and Hollywood oftentimes will hire some sort of expert, like if they're going to do a military movie or a spy movie. But after they've already put the story together, they'll hire someone to come in to say, what color would your shoes be, and what do the file cabinets look like? And that's all fine, but if the story is absurd, right, it doesn't matter if the file cabinets look right. And so we want to help get the story sort of to be more realistic, from the get-go.
Well, it's such an interesting project. I want to talk a little bit about what you'll be speaking about tonight, which is Russia under Putin. And without giving away the key points, what do you think are the biggest challenges that the U.S. faces as we try to interact and find some way forward?
Yeah, I think the U.S. has had a tough time sort of understanding Russia after the Soviet Union fell. And I think there has always been this assumption that Russia has wanted to be part of the West, and it was just a matter of, us getting it right, of us sort of, helping them understand where they want to go, of sort of, we've seen a series of different presidents try to reset or develop a relationship with President Putin, and oftentimes when that relationship seems to go sour with Russia, it's sort of almost like blaming ourselves, like, what are we doing wrong? Why aren't they responding to our sort of overtures? And one of the things I want to talk to about tonight, I think from my unique not my unique background, but unique background of coming from the intelligence services, we're looking at a man who runs a country and has run a country for 20 years who is a KGB officer. He grew up in a milieu, a mindset that ties to the former Soviet KGB and even the Tsarist, Okhrana and security services before that. And there's a history there that I think is useful to know when you look at someone like Vladimir Putin and you look at modern day Russia, to understand the mindset of sort of how they look at the world, how they see threats, and how they use their security and intelligence services as sort of their primary weapons. Right. In the United States, intelligence services are sort of value add. They're to provide information to policymakers to make policy, Whereas in Soviet Union and Russia today, it tends to be a much more frontline weapon that is used against enemies overseas and frankly domestically against their own population. Has been in the Soviet Union and now. And so I want to talk about sort of that history and what's behind Vladimir Putin to look at how we can engage with him. Maybe not improve relations, but be more wide-eyed and clear about him and our relationship with Russia.
So I think what you're saying is there's a political culture that endures long after ideology is swept away.
Oh, I think with Russia, that's very true and very interesting. So I think, there's academics look at places like Russia and you say, is this a mafia state? Is it a kleptocracy? Is it an authoritarian state with some differences from others, or is it just crony capitalism, corruption? There's different ways to look at it. I just want to add the piece of sort of the history of the intelligence and security services and how that overlay is important in understanding him, the man, and sort of how the country operates today.
And so, in a sense, it's still very much a KGB culture, right?
Well, I do think
government.
I do think that, and he grew up in that culture. He takes it very pride. Cheka was the Bolshevik security service that was created right after the Soviet Revolution, Russian Revolution. Every Czechist day in December, Vladimir Putin makes sure that he is not out of the country. He's at home to celebrate with his security services because I think he relies on them for keeping the population at home sort of at bay and repressed and dealing with enemies overseas. So I think it's an important way to look at Russia. And we have to understand that we've had 20 years with him now and we've tried all these different things to improve relations, and I think we need to be more clear-eyed about it's not us, it's him.
Right, yeah.
And he's not going to change.
Yeah, okay. That's terrific. I look forward to the talk tonight. Yeah. I want to conclude with another question. You talked about when you were a student, what you studied and at Hobart and then at Columbia as well. Many of the folks who will be watching this and hearing your talk this evening are, of course, students at Oklahoma State University. If you were to give advice to a student who might have a track that they think they want to go into some sort of international career or maybe not international career, what advice would you give them?
Sometimes people will ask, specifically about CIA, what should I do to, if I want to get hired at a place like CIA? And I think the answer probably similar to an answer that you would give is, we're looking, I should say larger U.S. government, but certainly the intelligence services, State Department, national security institutions, we're looking for people who actually are interested in the world. They're looking, they're people who are going to want to continue to study, to continue to understand. They're people who are, I want to read more books about it. I want to be in touch with people. I want to understand foreign cultures, and I think that's something you guys are doing here wonderfully well, bringing in foreign students and these other kind of things. And so there's not one answer. I think if people show a passion for something, to really dig down deep in it, and then when something new comes up, to dig into that as well. That shows a kind of understanding that any organization, frankly, but certainly in the national security space, they're going to want that kind of person, right? Certainly. Because essentially in our work, you're going to come in, you're going to be trained to do sort of espionage, and then you're going to go learn Japanese language, which is hard, and then you need to understand and be paying attention on your own to what are the issues in Japan, what are the political issues, what are the cultural issues, what is the history, what do I need to know, so that you can go out there and interact with the people and help the U.S. government better understand what Japan's up to. And then after a couple, 3 years of doing that, they're going to say, we need you to go to Colombia and learn Spanish and learn, and then we need you to go to Belarus and Tunisia and what have you. And so, you just have to sort of be interested in the world and continue to show that kind of passion, I think. Okay,
one final variation on that. What if we have a student who's not interested in the world? Why would you say you need to actually pay attention to these global events?
Well, I think, we're seeing that now. Some of the tribalism we're seeing in the United States, this passionate anger and sort of political fire we're seeing, some of that, frankly, is caused by international events. One of the things I'm going to talk about tonight on Russia is how much they study us, they look for our weaknesses, and they twist them and turn them against us. They're trying to find and anger certain populations in the United States because they know when we fight with ourselves, we are less of a threat to them because we're hurting ourselves. And These are sort of, we call it asymmetric tactics. You think how a terrorist can't take on an army by itself, but they can look for our weaknesses and take advantage of our weaknesses. Countries like Russia and others nowadays can use our weaknesses against us. And I think people need to sort of understand that the world, whether we like globalism or not, whether we like an interconnected world, whether we like immigrants coming, those type of things, it's a reality, and it's going to continue to grow and be more important. And so even if you don't have a passion for it, it is useful to understand that the world is interconnected, and some of the things you think are simple are much less simple than you might want to believe.
Certainly. I think of every time I look at my Facebook feed and I see all these memes that I say, that came from Moscow. That didn't come from Iowa. But John Sipher, thank you for being here with us, joining us here at Oklahoma State University. We look forward to your talk tonight, and we hope you enjoy your weekend in Stillwater.
Well, the victory over Baylor, I'll like it more, I'm sure. So,
Thanks for joining us on this, and we hope you also are able to watch tonight's talk with John Sipher, available on O State TV. Thanks so much.